All right, welcome to chapter 12. We're going to talk about manifest destiny in this chapter, and it's a lot of the expansion that was happening in the West during this time frame. So let's go ahead and get started. John Lewis O'Sullivan was a very popular editor and columnist, and he articulated the longstanding American belief in the God-given mission of the United States to lead the world in the peaceful transition to democracy. In a very little-read essay printed in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, O'Sullivan outlined the importance of annexing Texas to the United States. And this is a quote from him. "Why were other reasons wanting in favor of now elevating this question of the reception of Texas into the Union out of the lower region of our past party dissensions up to its proper level of a high and broad nationality? It surely is to be found abundantly in the manner in which other nations have undertaken to intrude themselves into, between us and the proper parties to the case, a spirit of hostile interference against us for an avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by providence of the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." No wonder it was a little red. O'Sullivan and many others viewed expansion as necessary to achieve America's destiny and to protect American interests. The quasi-religious call to spread democracy, coupled with the reality of thousands of settlers pressing westward, manifest destiny was grounded in the belief that the democratic agrarian republic would save the world. Although called into name in 1845, manifest destiny was widely held but vaguely defined belief that dated back to the founding of the nation. And you might want to know that for quiz purposes. Many Americans believed that the strength of American values and institutions justified moral claims to hemispheric leadership. Second, the lands on the North American continent west of the Mississippi River and later into the Caribbean were destined for American-led political and agricultural improvement. And then third, God and the Constitution ordained an irrepressible destiny to accomplish redemption and democratization throughout the world. All three of these claims pushed many Americans, whether they uttered the words manifest destiny or not, to actively seek the expansion of democracy. These beliefs and the resulting actions were often disastrous to anyone in the way of American expansion. The new religion of American democracy spread on the feet and in the wagons of those who moved west, imbued with the hope that their success would be in the nation's success. The Young America movement, strongest among members of the Democratic Party, but spanning the political spectrum, downplayed the divisions over slavery and ethnicity by embracing national union and emphasizing American exceptionalism, territorial expansion, and democratic participation. And that also, you do need to know what kind of was the idea behind the Young American movement for quiz purposes there. Those ideas that I just listed. Now, poet Ralph Waldo Emerson captured this political outlook for this new generation in a speech that he delivered in 1844 titled The Young American. In every age of the world, there had been a leading nation, one of a more generous sentiment, whose eminent citizens were willing to stand for the interests of general justice and humanity, at the risk of being called by the men of the moment chimerical and fantastic, which should be that nation but these states. Which should lead that moment, if not New England? Who should lead the leaders but the young Americans? However, many Americans, including Emerson, disapproved of aggressive expansion. From opponents of manifest destiny, the lofty rhetoric of the young Americans was nothing other than the kind of imperialism that the American Revolution was supposed to have repudiated. Many members of the Whig Party and later the Republican Party argued that the United States' mission was to lead by example, not by conquest. Abraham Lincoln subbed this up with his criticism with a fair amount of sarcasm during a speech in 1859. He, the young American, owns a large part of the world, but right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it. Young American had a pleasing hope, a fond desire, a longing after territory. He has a great passion, a perfect rage for the new, particularly new men of office, and the new earth mentioned in the Revelations, in which being no more sea, there must be about 3 times as much land as in the present. He is a great friend of humanity, and his desire for land is not selfish, but merely an impulse to extend the area of freedom. He is very anxious to fight for the liberation of enslaved nations and colonies, providing always that they have land. As to those who have no land and who would be glad of help from any quarter, he considers that they can afford to wait a few hundred years longer. In knowledge, he is particularly rich. He knows that he knows all that can possibly be known, inclines to believe in spiritual trappings, and is the unquestioned inventor of manifest destiny. But Lincoln and other anti-expansionists would struggle to win popular opinion. The nation, fueled by principles of manifest destiny, would continue westward. Along the way, Americans battled both native peoples and foreign nations, claiming territory to the very edges of the continent. But westward expansion did not come without a cost. It exacerbated the slavery question, pushed Americans toward civil war, and ultimately threatened the very mission of American democracy it was designed to aid. Now we'll look at Section 2, the antebellum Western migration and Indian removal. After the War of 1812, Americans settled the Great Lakes region very rapidly, thanks in part to aggressive land sales by the federal government. Missouri's admission as a slave state presented the first major crisis over westward migration, and American expansion in the antebellum period. Farther north, lead and iron mining spurred development in Wisconsin, which you do need to know for quiz purposes. By the 1830s and 40s, increasing numbers of German and Scandinavian immigrants joined Easterners in setting up the Missouri watershed. Little settlement occurred west of the Missouri as migrants viewed the Great Plains as a barrier to farming. Farther west, the Rocky Mountains loomed as undesirable to all but the fur traders, and the American Indians west of the Mississippi appeared too powerful to allow for wide expansion. Do not lounge in the cities, commanded publisher Horace Greeley in 1841. There's room and health in the country, away from the crowds of idlers and imbeciles. Go west before you are fitted for no life but that of the factory. The New York Tribune often argued that American exceptionalism required the United States to benevolently conquer the continent as the prime means of spreading American capitalism and American democracy. However, the vast West was not empty. American Indians controlled much of the land east of the Mississippi River and almost all of the West. Expansion really hinged on a federal policy of Indian removal. The harassment and dispossession of American Indians, whether driven by the U.S. government policy or the actions of individual Americans and their communities, depended on the belief in manifest destiny. Of course, a fair bit of racism was part of the equation as well. The political and legal processes of expansion always hinged on the belief that white Americans could best use new lands and opportunities. The belief rested on the idea that only Americans embodied the democratic ideals of the yeoman agriculturalism extolled by Thomas Jefferson and expanded under the Jacksonian democracy. Florida was really an early test for the creation of new lands. The territory held strategic value for the young nation's growing economic and military interests in the Caribbean. The most important factors that led to the annexation of Florida included anxieties over runaway slaves, Spanish neglect of the region, and the desired defeat of Native American tribes who controlled large portions of that lucrative farm territory. And you need to know those things for quiz purposes. During the early 19th century, Spain wanted to increase productivity in Florida and encouraged migration of mostly southern slave owners. By the second decade of the 1800s, Anglo settlers occupied plantations along the St. Johns River and from the border with Georgia to Lake George, 100 miles upstream. Spain began to lose control of the area quickly and became a haven for slave smugglers bringing illicit human cargo into the United States for lucrative sale to Georgia planters. Plantation owners grew apprehensive about the growing numbers of slaves running to the swamps and Indian-controlled areas of Florida. American slave owners pressured the U.S. government to confront the Spanish authorities. Southern slave owners refused to quietly accept the continued presence of armed black men in Florida as well. During the War of 1812, a ragtag assortment of Georgia slave owners, joined by a plethora of armed opportunists, raided Spanish and British-owned plantations along the St. Johns River. These private citizens received U.S. government help on July 27, 1816, when U.S. Army regulars attacked the Negro fort established as an armed outpost during the war by the British and located about 60 miles south of the Georgia border. This raid killed 270 of the fort's inhabitants as a result of the direct hit on the fort's gunpowder stores. This conflict set the stage for General Andrew Jackson's invasion of Florida in 1817 and the beginning of the First Seminole War. Americans also held that Creek and Seminole Indians, occupying the area from the Apalachicola River to the wet prairies and hammock islands of central Florida, were dangers in their own right. These tribes, known to the Americans collectively as the Seminoles, migrated into the region over the course of the 18th century and established settlements, tilled fields, tended herds of cattle in the rich floodplains and grasslands that dominated the northern third of the Florida Peninsula, and envious eyes looked upon these lands. After bitter conflict that often pitted Americans against a collection of Native Americans and former slaves, Spain eventually agreed to transfer the territory to the United States for $5 million and other territorial concessions. Now, after the purchase, planters from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Virginia entered Florida. However, the influx of settlers in the Florida territory was temporarily halted by the outbreak of the Second Seminole War. And for quiz purposes, you need to note that mostly free black men and women and escaped slaves occupied the Seminole District, a situation that deeply troubled slave owners. Indeed, General Thomas Sidney Jessup, U.S. commander during the early stages of the Second Seminole War, labeled that conflict a Negro, not an Indian war, fearful as he was that if a revolt was not speedily put down, the South would feel the effect of it on their slave population before the end of the next season. Florida became a state in 1845, and the settlement expanded into the former Indian lands. American action in Florida seized Indian eastern lands, reduced lands available for runaway slaves, and killed entirely or removed Indian peoples further west. This became the template for future action. Presidents since at least Thomas Jefferson had long discussed removal, but President Jackson took the most dramatic action. He believed it was a speedy removal that will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. Desires to remove American Indians from valuable farmland motivated state and federal governments to cease trying to assimilate Indians and instead plan for forced removal. So Congress passes the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Thereby granting the president authority to begin treaty negotiations that would give the American Indians land, particularly in the West, in exchange for their lands in the east of the Mississippi. A lot of advocates of removal, including President Jackson, paternalistically claimed that it would protect Indian communities from the outside influences and that it jeopardized their chances of becoming civilized farmers. Jackson emphasized this paternalism, the belief that the government was acting in the best interest of the native peoples, in his 1830 State of the Union address. Now, you do need to know what Jackson's paternalism really was for quiz purposes. He said, the removal, will separate the Indians from the immediate contact with settlements of whites, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become more interesting, civilized, and Christian community. The experience of the Cherokee was particularly brutal, despite many tribal members adopting some Euro-American ways, including intensified agriculture, slave ownership, Christianity. State and federal governments pressured the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee nations to sign treaties and surrender their land. Many of these tribal nations used the law in hopes of protecting their lands. Most notable among them was the Cherokee Nation's attempt to sue the state of Georgia. Beginning in 1826, Georgian officials asked the federal government to negotiate with the Cherokee to secure lucrative land. The Adams administration resisted the state's request, but harassment from local settlements against the Cherokee forced the Adams and Jackson administrations to begin serious negotiations with the Cherokee. Georgia grew impatient with the process of negotiation and abolished existing state agreements with the Cherokee that had guaranteed rights of movement and jurisdiction of tribal law. Now, Andrew Jackson penned a letter soon after taking office that encouraged the Cherokee, among others, to voluntarily relocate to the West. But the discovery of gold in Georgia in the fall of 1829 really further antagonized that situation. The Cherokee defended themselves against Georgia's laws by citing treaties signed with the United States that guaranteed them both their land and independence, and they appealed to the Supreme Court against Georgia to prevent dispossession of their land. The court sympathized with the Cherokee's plight, but it ruled that it lacked jurisdiction to hear the case. And then in a second associated case, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia laws did not apply within the Cherokee territory. Now, this seems like a victory, but regardless of these rulings, the state government ignored the Supreme Court and did very little to prevent conflict between the settlers and the Cherokee. Now, Jackson wanted a solution that might preserve peace and his reputation, so he sends Secretary of War Lewis Cass to offer title of Western lands and the promise of tribal governance in exchange for relinquishing the Cherokee's eastern lands. These negotiations opened a rift between the Cherokee Nation, and the Cherokee leader John Ridge believed removal was inevitable and pushed for a treaty that would give him the best terms. Otherwise called nationalists and led by John Ross, they refused to consider removal in negotiations. The Jackson administration refused any deal that fell short of large-scale removal from the Cherokee from Georgia, thereby fueling a devastating and violent intertribal battle between the two factions. Eventually, tensions grew to the point that several treaty advocates were assassinated by members of the other national faction. In 1835, a portion of the Cherokee Nation, led by John Ridge, hoped to prevent further tribal bloodshed. They signed the Treaty of New Icata. This treaty ceded lands in Georgia for $5 million, and the signatories hoped that limiting future conflicts between the Cherokee and white settlers would help. However, most of the tribe didn't adhere to those terms because they saw it as illegitimately negotiated. And John Ross pointed to the government's hypocrisy, saying, you asked us to throw off the hunter and the warrior state, we did so. You asked us to form a Republican government, we did so. Adopting your own as our model. You asked us to cultivate the earth and learn the mechanic arts, we did so. You asked us to learn to read, we did so. You asked us to cast away our idols and worship your God, we did so. And now you demand we cede you our lands. That we will not do. President Martin Van Buren in 1838 decided to press the issue beyond negotiation and court dealings, and he ordered the army to forcibly remove the Cherokee from the territory. Now, harsh weather, poor planning, difficult travel compounds and becomes the tragedy that we now know as the Trail of Tears, where 16,000 Cherokee are embarking on this journey, and only about 10,000 completed. Not every instant of removal was as treacherous or demographically disastrous as the Cherokee example, while on the other hand, some tribes violently resisted removal. Regardless, over 60,000 natives were forced west prior to the Civil War. The allure of manifest destiny encouraged expansion regardless of terrain or locale, and the Indian removal also took place to a lesser degree in northern lands. Moreover, the Indian, like the Black Hawk Indian removal, and leads the Sauk Indians to being sent to Kansas. And so it happened all over the United States for sure. Despite the disaster of removal, tribal nations slowly rebuild their cultures, and in some cases even achieved prosperity in the Indian Territory. Tribal nations blended traditional cultural practices, including common land systems, with Western practices, including constitutional government, common school systems, creating elite slaveholding classes. Some remained too powerful to remove, though. Beginning in the late 18th century, the Comanche rise to power in the Southern Plains region, which is now the southwestern United States. And for quiz purposes, you need to know what was really the main thing that the Comanche did to get this power. Well, their ability to adapt to horse culture, which was first introduced by the Spanish. They transformed from this foraging economy into a mixed hunting and pastoral society. After in 1821, the New Mexican state claimed the region as part of northern Mexico, but they had very little control, and the Comanche remained in power and controlled the economy of the Southern Plains. A very flexible political structure allowed the Comanche to dominate other Indian groups as well as the Mexicans and American settlers. The Comanche would launch raids into northern Mexico, and this really ends a very unprofitable but mostly peaceful diplomatic relationship with Mexico and the Comanche. They also forged new trading relationships with the Anglo-American traders in Texas, and it really gives them, along with some other independent native groups, a major economic influence on the region. Collectively, with their violent encounters in northern Mexico, it basically becomes an ongoing war throughout the 1830s and 40s as tribal nations vie for power and wealth. Comanche power really peaks with an empire that controls a vast territory in the trans-Mississippi West, known as Comancheria. By trading in Texas and raiding in northern Mexico, the Comanche control the flow of commodities, including captives and livestock and trade goods. They practice a fluid system of captivity, and they use these captives for economic exploitation, but also adopted captives into kinship networks. And this allowed for assimilation of diverse people into the region and into their empire. Now, this ongoing conflict with the region had sweeping consequences on both the Mexican and American politics. And the U.S.-Mexican War, beginning in 1846, can really be seen as the culmination of all of this violence in the area. The Great Basin region escalated with these patterns of violence, and it was really on the periphery of the Spanish Empire, but nonetheless, it integrated into the vast commercial trading network of the West. Mexican officials and Anglo-American traders entered the region with their own imperial designs. New forms of violence spread into the homelands, and all the way to the western Shoshone. Traders and settlers and Mormon religious refugees, along with other, U.S. officials and soldiers, encountered daily acts of violence, and this lays the groundwork for a very violent conquest of the region. The remaining natives there have to, fight over the ever decreasing amount of land, and what this wide incursion in the ongoing Indian Wars really result in a very traumatic dispossession of land and a struggle for subsistence. The federal government tries, more than just relocate American Indians. They want to civilize them and Americanize them, and they see this as a way to kind of show how great America is and the paternal care that America has. Thomas McKinney was the superintendent of trade from 1816 to 1822 and the superintendent of Indian affairs, and he serves as the main architect for a civilization policy. He basically said that American Indians were morally and intellectually equal to whites, and he wants to, establish a national Indian school system. Now, Congress rejects his ideas there, but they do pass the Civilization Fund Act that gives $10,000 to be allocated towards societies that fund missionaries and schools among Indian tribes. And a lot of these people that kind of are educated then stand on behalf of the natives in their attempts to form treaties later on. After the removal in the 1830s, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, they begin to collaborate with missionaries. They build school systems, as I said, and they, want to ensure generations of political sovereignty. And so, once again, in 1852, the school system that the Cherokee Nation opens up ends up with, 21 schools, a national enrollment of over 1,100 students, and these students are integral to the future of the Cherokee Nation, and other native tribes followed very similar paths. That's going to take us to Section 3, the life and culture in the West.